on. So we have a full house up here at the front. Thank you for everybody who has stayed. And we'll keep moving along for our panelists. We have our first panelist is a panelist duo. Okay.
Well, thank you very much. I hope we're all energized and enthused about the final panel. Thank you very much. The panelists are, I'm sure of that. The panelists are. Do I have the slides? So this topic, okay, so like many things in ESCAR, projects happen somewhat serendipitously. So I was chatting with Susan a couple months ago and hearing about her projects and mentioning that I was involved in a project at Alliance for Peacebuilding entitled Neuroscience, Spirituality, and Peacebuilding. And in this project, the main theme was the centrality of compassion in various forms of practice and how to promote that. So Susan says, whoa, compassion's all over conflict resolution, interactive conflict resolution. And so we said, yeah, let's do a paper for the conference. So we have a paper, it's uploaded, and you can access it and find the spelling mistakes, among others. Okay, and let me know. Our primary theme is that certain forms of conflict resolution practice are defined around systemic compassion. So that sounds kind of weird, obviously. How can compassion be systemic? Well, part of the answer is that we're invoking a notion of practice which allows for it being systemic. And this notion of practice comes from, I think, a very important thinker, Pierre Bourdieu, who has a very rich, rigorous, and I think conflict user-friendly idea of practice. And basically, practice, he says, well, practice, there's patterns of practice and so on. I don't have time to go into it. But basically, we are arguing that socially sanctioned patterns of practice in a field give primacy to the norm of compassion. In other words, what's systematic is that you have these patterns of practice, many different sectors in our field, obviously, and an organizing, quote, principle is compassion. But principle used in a very loose sense. In fact, it's not even the same principle from one sector of conflict resolution to another. Okay, so you're asking, okay, yeah, prove it. All right, so we'll try. So one of our motivations is that it comes from experimental psychology. In fact, this is kind of the analog model or motivating mode of knowledge which is inspiring us. In particular, moral psychology, which is very experimental, has undergone or basically represents pretty much a revolution in psychology. And I think our field, which by the way broadcasts as addressing the whole person, has not kept up with that. In fact, it's pretty, to my knowledge, I haven't seen much close interaction with moral psychology. But psychologists, first they say compassion, usually is defined as two criteria. First, a sensitivity to the pain or suffering of others. And second, a deep desire to alleviate that suffering. So this is a standard definition. And psychologists have also demonstrated, I think really, which is very important implications, that compassion can be induced under certain conditions for certain people. And for example, just very briefly, compassion has been identified in the neuroscience from brain studies, and it has been identified as a separate emotion, that is depicted in this graph by the red dots, certain what's called differential plasticity, which basically reflects the fact that compassion can be induced under certain conditions. Interesting studies about the difference between compassion and empathy. These basically agitate or basically are located at different portions, different neural networks in the brain. They are different emotions, and they have basically the different experiential implication. So what we're doing is using that basically as a model, or basically as motivation, for formulating a norm of compassion which we believe is embedded already in 3 domains of conflict resolution practice. So our project is not utopian. We'd love to make the world more compassionate, but our project is reflective. We are reflecting on current modes of practice and, in a sense, reflecting on the field. So the first domain of practice, in which the norm of compassion is central as an organizing principle, as it were systemic, is obvious: international humanitarian law. We all know Universal Declaration of Human Rights basically elevates the human family as basically born with the inherent worth. And the compassion is focused basically, ironically, this model of human rights is both an equality model and it's an inequality model. That is, it has a characteristic of the equality for the inherent dignity of everyone and the inequality of the vulnerability of certain groups. And this is just a chart we put together of identified vulnerable groups, which we all know from specific UN resolutions. The second domain of practice, that was, as it were, we can call that kind of top-down domain of practice, which, as we've heard from many people, including people today, is under extreme critique and promoting basically alternatives of another model. And this is the norm of compassion in certain practices of everyday peace. And this is a burgeoning field of which we're very fortunate to have an expert at SCAR, Professor Furchow, on this. Everyday peace reflects an emic perspective to peace building. It's kind of the habitus of everyday and community ethics. And there's some practices which clearly, absolutely, without question, give primacy to a norm of compassion. And these certainly not all practices of everyday peace, but a form of practice that has been well. Whose clock was that? Oh, that's mine. A form of practice that has been very well documented is the rescue work of civilians in harm's way, certainly World War II, and I had done a study of this for Hutu rescuers of Tutsis in Rwanda. And I am now going to turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you, Dan. I have to say, this has been really fun working on this together, and fun presenting together as well. So as Dan said, this is not a utopian approach that we've taken, but rather looking at compassion and its practice and its practicalness and pragmatism. So, and specifically what I want to turn to now is looking at compassion in interactive conflict resolution, which Ron Fisher has defined as conflict analysis or problem-solving discussions in a workshop format that are directed towards mutual understanding of the conflict and the development of collaborative actions to de-escalate and eventually resolve it. And so what I've found in my experience with various forms of interactive conflict resolution, sometimes direct experience, sometimes studying it, has been that if we look at compassion, going back to the definition that Dan presented, the sensitivity to the pain or suffering of another person and the deep desire to alleviate that suffering, that is built into what happens in these workshops. It's a very practical thing that if we want to, if we take the problem-solving workshop approach, if we want to solve a problem, we need to understand it, we need to have a sensitivity to it, we need to have this depth of understanding that comes from really fully understanding what is this other person's suffering or pain. And then in order to solve the problem, you gotta solve their suffering or pain, right? I mean, you can't just solve the problem in a way that only works for one side, because that's not going to be a lasting solution. So it's a really practical approach we've taken to compassion. So the norms of interactive conflict resolution, they require, this kind of echoes what I just said, the sympathetic understanding of the other, a display of caring for the efforts, integrity, and moral worth of others, and compassion functions then as a regulative norm of dialogue, a precondition for positive interaction. Compassion is a precondition for being able to get to the goals we've got for this workshop. There are 4 forms of compassion practice which we go through in the paper for interactive conflict resolution. One is the analytical problem-solving workshop approach. A second is the psychodynamic approaches, sustained dialogue, and training and dialogue. And then we also offer in the paper a case study. Surprise, surprise, this case study looks at the conflict over South Ossetia and the ways that compassion practices have been part of various forms of interactive conflict resolution in that setting. And so what we found there are the set of interactive conflict resolution workshops that I've facilitated starting in 2008 have gone through 3 main phases. And in those phases, compassion has had a key role in a different way for each phase. The first phase, well, the first meeting was kind of a, oh my God, do they really want to talk to each other? Everybody was like worried, were we going to have anything to talk about? And the humanitarian issues came out as something that it was reasonable so soon after the war to talk about. They were ready to talk about humanitarian issues. And so we focused on, who's hungry, who's cold, who doesn't have any heating gas, who doesn't have water, et cetera. And those humanitarian issues became the point of the whole first phase of the workshops. Then in the next phase, what I've called catalytic workshops, the workshops focused on needing still that sensitivity to the other and the experience of the other. What is the suffering? Let's alleviate that for both sides. And the catalytic workshops sought to catalyze other confidence-building measures that would address some of these areas of suffering. And then finally, we're now in a phase where there are these ongoing meetings that have a point because it's maintaining that compassionate understanding. Things change over 6 months in this conflict context, and meeting again fine-tunes that compassionate understanding to the current context. So we'll conclude, as I think we have 0 minutes left, with acknowledging also that, of course, compassion, I guess I'll go back to the main point of compassion being a practical approach. There we go, that's my timer too. That if we can understand the suffering of the other, have a sensitivity to it, have a desire to address it, and then actually do address that, then we've got people who aren't suffering anymore, right? And when people are not suffering, they are less likely to resort to violence. Thank you.
I'm not supposed to do that, right? Okay. Well, Dan and I have followed a similar path that we both are trained in philosophy, and we also have become fascinated by neuroscience and conflict resolution and peace building. My trajectory comes out of a frustration with traditional forms of conflict resolution over a period of 30 years in Israel-Palestine and about 13 years in Syria. And I've come to understand some of the things that were just completely intractable based on not only the wonderful theories of our field, but also some of the things that I've learned from Lakoff about neural nets, and also what I've learned about the difference in verbal skills between people of different classes and races and genders. And that many of the dialogues and negotiations we were trying to do in Syria and other places just were pointless and very often destructive. But the worst aspect of it was that it took at least 5 years to figure out that each and every person in the room was being controlled by a different country. So that it took a long time for Syrians to realize how occupied they were by Iran, Russia, Saudi, Qatar, and UAE, and even more. Iraqi-based ISIS, and even ISIS in the name of Iran. I mean, there's many, many dastardly concoctions that made it impossible for people to dialogue on a formal level. In the midst of this catastrophe, what emerged was that the women and others across religious lines found a way to practice in the middle of massive loss and PTSD. Each one of them would have 20 people dead in their family, 30 people dead in their family. And we found that compassion for children did something that nothing else was doing. It found a way to build relationships and even a way to mourn and a way to move forward. And as I started to reflect on what is this about, what's going on here, I was at the same time reading intensively on what the 18th century Enlightenment really was, the key focus of combinations of reason and compassion in moral sense theory and deontology of Kant, and the calculus, the rational calculus of the consequentialists and utilitarians. And I started to realize that there's something very special here that has great potential, and that's compassionate reason. As opposed to the 17th century and as opposed to a lot of the excessive rationalism of the early 20th century in response to the horror of fascism, the way that compassion actually enhances reason, it actually enhances the search for universal values, is embedded within religious and spiritual traditions and Enlightenment traditions, namely that the golden rule, the concept of empathy with the other, turns out to have a very emotional foundation and a very rational foundation, because it becomes the basis for universal rules. And that became a very different project in terms of the people that we were working with, and something that broke the neural nets that were absolutely closed down. The capacity for compassion, the feeling of compassion, the practice with children overwhelmed what was impossible in dialogue and negotiation. So I became very intrigued with that and saying, are we on the cutting edge of some new forms of practice? And can we explore this further? And what does neuroscience have to teach us about what's actually happening? And I'll just focus, because there's very little time, on one particular study that hasn't even been put into a book yet, and it's by two women in Europe, Olga Klemecki and Tanya Zinger, and Olga's taken time off to have a baby. So this is in its infancy. But basically, there's a vast difference between what we call empathy and what we call compassion. And it turns out that empathy actually depresses your metabolic rate. It increases diabetes. It does many things that are destructive over time. Whereas compassion, or what Dalai Lama calls loving kindness, actually does the opposite. It's life enhancing, it's emotion enhancing, and it leads to rational action, whereas empathy leads to apathy and despair and self-destructive behavior. So this difference, in my mind, essentially, it captured what's been going wrong with practitioners for the past 30 years. Because as I watched every single practitioner burn out in Israel-Palestine and in Syria, this was the reason. There was excessive empathy among the peace builders for the losses, and there was no vision of a future of love and compassion and satisfaction. And the violent groups were also excessively empathic with their own group. In other words, the Alawites that were killing everybody in sight, they were defending their group. So they had an incredible amount of empathy for the future genocide that they would face if they didn't side with Assad. So empathy explained the hardened nature of everything, and also its relationship to the amygdala, which is lower in the brain, millions of years old, fear, anger, rage, fight or flight, and compassion, which was in the fMRIs, lights up all sorts of rational sections of the brain. The fMRI work is critical here. It releases the person. The same thing that neuroscientists are discovering about surprise. Why do clowns release our brain into new forms of thinking? Why do we rethink the world with comedy? Why do we rethink the world because of Trump? Because when you repeat things a great deal and you never know what he's going to say next, he captures your brain for shock. So all of this neuroscience work is suggesting new forms of practice. It's suggesting, for example, that liberal elite forms of conflict resolution have focused on the word and dialogue and not on repetition. Repetition went out with the old-fashioned ways of religion. mantras, repetitions, but it turns out the brain desperately needs repetition in order to create new neural pathways. So we haven't even begun to figure out how to do that. For example, I was just in a closed meeting with Syrians in an emergency meeting, and we're looking at, we're saying, okay, the military spent $1 billion on messaging that was an entire waste because they consulted Wall Street instead of imams. Pretty stupid, but it just happens all the time. And we asked ourselves, what would it look like to have effective repetition? What would go into the heart and would transform a person's perspective? And we all have friends in this work who are on the front lines. Many of them are Democrats. That the practice, on the contrary, leads to those rational spaces among both secular and religious on the ground. And we're looking to figure out what breaks the neural net of hatred, the neural net of refusal to admit the humanity of the other. And this is what we're facing right here in Virginia and in the United States. What breaks that net? And it turns out what breaks it the most is care. Care and service. So that we started to shift towards projects where we thought about how can we serve you, which is totally counterintuitive to social justice values. Why would you want to care for white supremacists in Virginia who are having trouble on their farms? Well, it turns out that it's a form of conversion. You can't say that, but it challenges the brain and it shocks the brain. And as that cognitive dissonance and shock sets in year after year, people like Daryl Davis, look up Daryl Davis, he's converted 200 members of the Ku Klux Klan. He's an African American. And after the relationship with him, which was not teaching, it was simply relationship and listening, 200 decided they couldn't take it anymore, and the Klan didn't speak to who they are. Now, that's not how you change a whole society, but it is how we start to think about how can we scale this up? What would it mean to change our methods of education and propagation of this approach, counterintuitive approach, to the enemy other, to the violent other? And I'll leave it right there because I think that I only have 10 seconds left. So that's good.
So I'm waiting for the slides, yes. I win the prize. I've given myself the prize for the funkiest slides of the day. So just prepare yourself. Okay. It's blue, see? And it has very little to do with what anyway, I, like Thomas, have shifted my stuff around without, So I want to, the idea of reconciliation, what is it and how does that work, is something I was asked to do by a journal and a group of colleagues that are now my colleagues in London. And I hadn't looked at it before in any consistent way. I've done some peace building thinking and writing and this and that. So I'm going to go back to the beginning. So pain and imagining. There has been some talk earlier about the idea of pain and suffering and grief. So pain unmakes the world. This is ways to think about it. Yeah, pain I'm going to be unmaking and making and recategorizing and recreating. Pain unmakes the world and imagining makes it. Some would say that happens through narrative in some ways. Together, pain and imagining are the framing events. I'm proposing that we can think about this. They're the framing events within whose boundaries all other perceptual, somatic, and emotional events occur. Now, if this is true, thus between the two extremes can be mapped the whole terrain of the human psyche. Now, how much we buy into that or not, it's an interesting way to think about it. At least I think it is. No, I can only touch certain things. All right. Carolyn Nordstrom wrote a book a while back about her field work in Mozambique during the Civil War. That woman did some really rockin' field work. She was not averse to climbing in the back of a pickup truck and driving around and, knocking back palm wine with the guys. I mean, just what I wish I could have done. So I'm going to use some of her ideas in helping me think through this. So if reality is regenerative and not fixed, not linear, not even possibly sometimes discernible, people cannot simply recreate what has been before. In terms of peace building and reconstruction and reintegration, integrate into what if something has been destroyed? So that might be some just semantics, but it bothers me. So if people refashion their lives as they used to know them before whatever happened, if that were even possible, then they would recreate the conditions of their vulnerability and set themselves up in a potentially same situation. That's an if-then. If this happens, does that happen? And she writes that from her, and this is what she got from her respondents in Mozambique and how she concluded from what they had to say. So self, culture, and reality are regenerative. Culture is not static. Culture is multifaceted. It changes over time. Read Kevin's book. It's a fluid thing. It's complex. It is in some ways, or a lot of ways, the endowment of significance. What is significant, and contrary to that, what is less significant or not significant? And how do those things change over time? And how do they change after the violent onslaught of war or rape or any of those dynamics that the negative stuff we've been talking about? So in terms of reintegration, or no, not that, reconciliation. Reconciliation, I get hung up on that thing. Anyway, so I went to Sierra Leone to do my dissertation fieldwork in 2004. The war was winding down. It was pretty, whatever. It was interesting. I had a great time in terms of the whole, by great time, it was really informative. Drove in from the heliport into town to find my guest house, big banner across where everybody goes in, forgive and forget. That was reconciliation at that moment. I didn't see it as such, but that's a pattern in various places. We're just going to forgive everybody willy-nilly without prejudice, and we're just going to forget all about it. It's one way to think about that. So the idea about that, the uncertainty about potential renewed violence, let's just nip it in the bud. Let's just, as they say in Liberia, and the traditional leaders when they do their conflict resolution practices, we're putting cement on it. It's done. Partly the people were war weary. When I talked to folks, they were just glad the war was over because it was brutal. And there existed at that same time of war weariness a corresponding generalized hope. Things had to get better. It seemed like we just were hoping that. And there's those other things which I'll just skip. So how do we make whole something that has been broken? And that, I'm not sure that that's possible. I tend to come into these things with a slight skeptical eye. But anyway, so the reconciliation approach can be, this is from the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is one of the few, it may be the only, but I don't want to say it is the only, but I believe it is. Is it the only one, Mara? Truth and Reconciliation process in the United States. Greensboro, North Carolina. So for them, their team and their community decided that reconciliation means to bring together those parts that were torn apart. And when harm is done, we all work together to recognize and undo the damage. And they link reconciliation and real justice. And that is, again, something to think about for that community. That's the way they determined it. Okay, I'll just whiz through these quickly. The tort model is we're going to pay damages, reparations. And reparations can be extremely important. We're hearing from various folks in the US, okay, what kind of reparations? Is affirmative action reparation enough? Possibly not. And then there's the atonement model. So we're going to give you reparations, damages, and we're also going to apologize as the moral aspect to the payment. So there's the practical and the moral aspects of response to whatever was wronged. And then there's the ethics of ultimate ends. We are going to do this because it's the right thing to do. And the ethics of responsibility, we're going to sort of a Bavarian kind of framing. We're going to do this because it's the moral thing to do. The right and the moral are not necessarily the same. Am I pushing the wrong button? Possibly. Okay, so this is the exciting part. Localized praxis of reconciliation. So building a little bit off of Daniel's response to my spiritual question, the National Ex-Combatants Peace-Building Initiatives in Liberia. I talked to some guys years ago in Liberia, and they had formed this. They called it NEPI. They had gone through the government. They were recognized. I have a copy in my files of their paperwork for the legitimization of their organization. And what they explained to me was that the DDR and all that sort of thing seemed to ignore completely the traditional religious practices that led to some of that were important in initiation into the war. These guys, and the ones I talked to they were probably in their 20s by this point, 25. They had been studied by Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. They were in the Weinstein and Humphreys reports. They were in, you name it, anything around Liberia. They didn't have their names in it, but that's the group that they were talking to. And they watched and they learned. So they can do research like nobody's business. They can write proposals. They can do field work. They learned. And they said, if these guys are doing it, and we don't think they're doing it right, we're going to do it the way it makes sense in our place. And they talked to these guys. They talked to the guys in red light, which is not the red light district. It means there used to be the only standing traffic signal in Liberia, which no longer is there, of course. And it was gone then, but it was known as red light because that's where it was. And that's where a lot of the guys that came back from the war and did not go through what NEPI was really convinced needed to happen was the traditional healing ceremonies. So they went through traditional power-giving practices. They were blessed with particular amulets, different kinds of scarring. It depended. New names. They had different clothing. They were given spiritual gifts that were, and if you did, I believe it. But the thing was, they needed to come back to that same chief who had done that and have the healing process done. And generally speaking, most of those chiefs were dead, and it was problematic. So they were taking over their own, using also some of the processes they'd been from the West into that. And I won't say this right because I haven't heard the word. It has to be said in that Sierra Leone accent that I can't. Remember, Ketopa Youth Development Association, we're trying to buy farmland. Youth generally didn't want to farm after the war, but these guys did. And so they were trying to raise money to buy farmland and in that way create their own community of youth who'd been displaced. The Council of Quilombos, worked with them in Brazil. We spent a month, 3 weeks to a month with them, Casey Suarez and I and some students, and did some skill building that they asked for. They have papers from the government. They have expanded their network. They have brought in people from different districts and so on. Now the vagina monologues, that might be an odd one to have in this thing in terms of reconciliation. So the National NEPI reconciled at least with some of the folks that were completely forgotten. And they reconciled the skills from the traditional with the skills from the West. The Tankopa folks reconciled to the past of farming and the land. The spirits live on the land. They walk, I believe it. And so they were hearkening back, which was unusual. Mostly a lot of the other ones wanted to go forward in a different way. And the Quilombos networked with expanded with the landless folks, with different parts of the Quilombo community. Vagina monologues, I was in Kosovo in March. And Kosovo is, the University of Pristina is incredibly sexist. It's just, that's how it is. And I was involved with the radical feminist group there, so I heard all about it. But anyway, we happened to we went to this production in Pristina of the Vagina monologues, which I had never seen up to that point. It was done in Serbian and Albanian, meaning somebody would speak in Serbian, somebody would do their part in Albanian, somebody would do their, and it just went back and forth. And they had great hats. They had the best hats ever. And there was on the back screen, there was it in English, which I was more interested in listening to the Serbian and the Albanian and trying to sort language families out. But anyway, so the idea of reconciliation is fluid. It has to do with making and remaking and recreating something, or creating something, shifting something, and allowing for a myriad of opportunities to be whatever the groups decide they want to be.
Thank you to the panel, and we have an opportunity to hear from our two discussants.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Angelina. I'm being told to move. And I'm a PhD student here at SCAR. I'd like to thank the panel for sharing their work this afternoon and thank all of you for still being here. I would personally like to say that I did not know Dr. Sandole, but this is the perfect time because we were talking about compassion and healing. And I wonder if we could take a moment to observe 10 seconds of silence for Dr. Sandole and everything that he has offered to the community, the school, and pay our respects to him and his family. You're welcome to gently lower your vision or close your eyes. 10 seconds. Thank you very much. So I thought that would be interesting because we're talking a lot about compassion and we're intellectualizing compassion. And when you actually put compassion into practice, it's very different. When you get people in the room who have suffered grave abuses and they've been violated, and as one of the panelists said, you know, people that potentially hate each other, they're not able or willing to listen to each other, and to say that compassion will emerge in that discussion is unknown. It's not guaranteed, and we don't know that it always emerges. And I'm digesting a lot of information today. This is the last panel, and we've heard some fascinating things all morning and all afternoon, so I'm trying to pull it all together as I'm sharing my comments here quickly. I think we've heard all along today the various epistemological approaches to conflict resolution, to practices, and I think what this panel has really brought forward is the moral aspect of conflict resolution work, and what my colleague Umet mentioned, that here we're dealing with real people, we're dealing with persons. And so that moral philosophical architecture and what that means for conflict resolution going forward. And so I'll start with Dr. Allen and Dr. Rothbart, and thank you very much for the paper. I think it's high time and the moment is right for us to talk about compassion. You mentioned in your paper that we look at systems of hatred and fear and anger, etc. And it is a great moment for us to look at systems of compassion. So I love the idea of systemic compassion. Being a practitioner of meditation and yogic philosophy and mindfulness myself for the better part of the last 10 years, and bringing this into my own approach to conflict resolution, I think it is indeed critical, and I hear what everyone on the panel has been saying. So my first question to you is that in the paper, you outline compassion as understood from a very much a Western philosophical and psychological perspective. And I wonder if other traditions, whether it's Buddhism or Indic philosophies or other philosophers who do not come from a Western tradition, how would they conceptualize compassion, and what would it mean for conflict resolution? And do you think that would add value to our discourse and to the practice of conflict resolution and how we approach it? And my second question is to the entire panel in general. As we are reimagining, leveraging the technical knowledge, the spirituality, the value that is localized within communities and people who are experiencing violence and conflict, how do you see the field of conflict resolution moving forward in bridging that tension between what the local practice is doing and saying and the more theoretical macro aspect of conflict resolution? Because from today's presentation, there clearly seems to be a clear disconnect between what happens locally in terms of knowledge, practice, and theory, and what happens on the larger scale. So how do you see moving forward, and what is the role of, say, compassion and healing within those practices? You mentioned, Dr. Gopin, frustration with the traditional practices, and I wonder if you could comment on where do you see the conflict resolution practices moving forward, and how can we insert this notion of compassion beyond just the minimal definition of sensitivity towards someone's pain and a desire to alleviate that suffering? Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was really very interesting. A lot of concepts that were discussed by the panelists were actually very new for me, and it was very interesting to hear them and to have a little time to reflect on them. And going to the discussion presented by Professor Allen and Professor Rothbart, I think I really like the idea of having all these three domains and how we can exercise and how compassion fits into all the three domains within conflict resolution field. And going from there, I think my practical question as a conflict resolution practitioner, I would be along the lines, if we're talking about compassion as a quality, or exercising the systemic compassion as a quality of a peace-building practitioner bringing to the table, or this is something that should be the focus of our conflict resolution practice, where we, quote unquote, infect our participants with the compassion, or like stimulate, brainwash them with it. I really appreciate, Professor Gopin, your vision about the role of compassion in conflict resolution practices, because all this time we were learning how we're framing the conflict resolution around the empathy and understanding of the other side. But what I think I hear you saying was that the empathy limits our practices in a way, and compassion adds more flexibility to conflict resolution practices, opening more doors and opportunities for engagement. And I would like to hear if this is, I understood correctly, and if you can talk a little bit more about that. And for Dr. Maulden, I really, that was really interesting, because my research goes along the lines of reconciliation and how we think and conceptualize reconciliation. And I think it's very interesting to think along the lines of regenerating or recreating something. But what it seems to me you're offering is that through this reconciliation praxis, we are creating, we're not recreating, we're creating something qualitatively very new that is not repeating the flawed, probably, practices of the past. And I was wondering if this is what you meant by in your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. And I think we'll take first a chance to respond to the discussants, and then we'll open it up for questions.
So Angelina, thank you for the question about the non-Western approaches to compassion. The one that I'm most familiar with non-Western would be a Tibetan Buddhist approach to loving kindness. And there's a sense of cultivating loving kindness and a daily practice of thinking, for example, and this gets to the repetition that Marc spoke to, of just as I want happiness and don't want suffering, so too this other person wants happiness and doesn't want suffering. Or a practice of saying, may you be happy, may you not suffer. So I'll just leave it at that.
We were talking about, thank you for your question, and both. This morning we were talking about truth, and I'd just like to convey my opinion about knowledge. There's no scientific theory that can be proven to be true. Certainly not in the physical sciences. And so the theories basically give us kind of a cognitive opening to visualize certain domain in a field of interaction. So systemic compassion basically induces us to look for certain practices. The problem is, as Angelina mentioned, we are trained with from Western sources of use of words. And so I'm invoking moral psychology, Jonathan Haidt, very much Western-centric way of thinking. And so the question becomes an imperative question for this project. How do you translate this word in a way that's productive for us to understand loving kindness, other cultures? So within this project is the imperative to translate, which that is to say, to have some sense of understanding the other in order for us to even understand what compassion is. But I do think it leads us to look for certain modes of practice and how we understand those.
Can I address Margarita's question too? And also thank you, Margarita, for your question. From practitioner to practitioner here, practical, what does this mean in practice? You asked about, is it a quality the peace builder brings in the room? Yes. Or is it something you infect the participants? I wouldn't say infect so much as inoculate that if we look at the disease being the hatred, someone earlier quoted Nelson Mandela as having said something about the human brain is structured to love more than to hate. So if we can return the human brain to its preferred approach, that would be the way I would look at it. And I do think that compassion is infectious. That being around compassionate people can bring that out in others too.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that, great questions and analysis from can I talk?
Yeah. Only Dan and Susan need the microphone.
Right.
That's right.
You're special. You're special. You're very special.
Academics.
So, as a few things to say. One is that we have to stop. Big surprise in ICAR. We have to stop SCAR. We have to stop thinking in zero-sum terms. This is not about these practices being superior to traditional negotiation, problem-solving workshop, etc. It's about the fact that in reality, many more things were happening that made peace in the past beyond those negotiations. So that even though all of that massive preparation for Camp David the first time was essential, the only reason why it didn't fail is because Jimmy Carter brought the pictures of grandchildren to the two leaders, and they started to cry. And then they said, let's try again, which is exactly the opposite of the moral nightmare and outrage of the Arafat-Barak meeting. Because the people who ran it lacked moral intelligence, they lacked an understanding of who was in the room and what they needed, whereas Carter intuited it. So it's not about negotiations versus. It's about everything that Chris Mitchell taught in his books and many others, and Dennis Oliver Sholem, that they understood the integration necessary. Now, it is framed sometimes in Western language, But the reality is that all of the neuroscience research is because of actually Tibetan Buddhist meditation and the Dalai Lama on loving kindness and the changing of the brain based on that meditation. That's how it all began, actually. So there's a matter here of Confucian and Taoist balance, where some people clearly are extremely destructive in the theater of conflict because they lack empathy. But many others who are the active peacemakers are being destructive to themselves because they have too much empathy. They haven't cultivated compassion. They haven't cultivated love. They've cultivated guilt and anger and rage because it's so easy when you're facing people who've lost 50 relatives and they're destroyed in front of you. It takes, you know, Doug knows, it takes a tremendous working on character. Now, this difference also between science and religion and spirituality. There was a crazy, brilliant Jewish scholar once who said, nonsense is nonsense, but the history of nonsense is scholarship. So what's missing here from the Western academia is the taking seriously of emotions as a scientific reality, both negative emotions and positive emotions. The reality that ritual changes people's consciousness. It doesn't matter whether you believe in their magic or in their religion. It doesn't matter at all. What matters is that you honor it as an exciting form of the brain changing in front of your eyes. And then you say, oh my God, this is like discovering gold. What can we do with this? How do we work? Is somebody more secular going to buy into that? What about a Liberian who's from the city? Is he really going to buy into that? We have to do our magic on how to integrate it. It's not about either or, it's about integration of these incredible skills. It's not about the room even, it's not about the workshop room. It's actually about all of those other ways that people shock each other into love. Gestures, caring for their kids, food, you know, etc.
I have
Oh, I'm sorry.
I might. Yeah, yeah. So looking at the question regarding the knowledge practice theory, local to global kind of thing, which is I've given it some thought, and I haven't surprisingly come up with an answer to it. The money comes from the global. The investment comes from outside. So if investment, that's usually money and material. If that comes from somebody making a decision in Geneva or New York, it's going to look nothing like Kakata in Liberia. It's just not. And so that there's a huge disconnect, although that provides, of course, that going through the different levels of government that the money does, that there is even enough money to get down to Kakata, which is, if Thomas was here, I'd say, what about Ellen? You know, whatever. But that's another matter. So the idea of, okay, is if it's money and material that is going to make a difference, and in some cases it does. That's one kind of way to healing, if it is a way for people to have access to resources that are necessary for their lives. And the compassion it can be seen as, in a certain kind of way, material compassion, if that's how it's presented. Mm-hmm. Okay. At the local level, I don't know how many of you ever worked, in any kind of work you do, it's difficult to really completely get something that I'm not familiar with. I'll also just use myself as a bad example. It's hard for me to get living in Robertsport in Liberia. I was there, I spent some time there and did this stuff with these folks and talked to market women and I don't get it because it's outside my experience. But what I can bring to them is, in some ways, all I could bring was the ability to listen, the ability to honor, and the ability to, if they asked me to do something that was within my ability to do, I could do it. And that may be small in West African terms, but that's sometimes what we have to offer.
It's big.
It's huge. It can be huge. And so it doesn't have to be $1 billion. I mean, it would be nice to do some building of houses in infrastructure, but that never seems to happen. So there's, there's that. So I don't have how that, the sequence of that. I just know that very little of the global goes down to the local. And if you try to impose some of that stuff on the local, they know exactly what's going on. I've been to gender training in the self-same Kakata. And so I went to we took students and we went to the men's gender sensitivity training. And we saw The Whale Rider. Has anybody seen The Whale Rider?
Yeah.
It's an awesome movie. And they were really impressed. And they had notebooks, they had pencils, and they had their photograph on the top of their booklet, their group photograph. And we talked about, just see this young woman could call the whale. She was strong. Then we went to the women's. They had no notebooks, no pencils, no nothing. And we talked about the kinds of marriage in Liberia, which they already knew, of course, and the bride price, dowering. So it was really interesting for me to hear in the Christian, the traditional, and the Muslim, what the requirements were. But there was an international organization that wrote curriculum for that. They put money in it. They trained the people in the office to which we went later, and we didn't say anything negative, but we asked questions. And the students asked about, anyway, it doesn't matter. It was not exactly what that organization had in mind. For the men, yes, maybe, but not for the women. So why was that? Why are rapes not, why is that? And that's international issues. But so that's a problem. In terms of praxis and regenerating, I'm throwing those things out there as ideas that might, if I think about it, if I'm doing this work, it might break through some of my long-held assumptions. It might call me out to question what I'm doing and why, and to make me rethink my moral frame and my, what I don't recognize as intrusive and as I think this is right, so I'm going to give it to you and you'll see how right I am that I thought it was right. And I try not to do that, but it's hard to resist. It's hard to weed that out completely. So,
Are you going to take the microphone to people with questions? Okay.
Thank you all for a wonderful panel. So I have a question for Dr. Maulden and then for Dr. Gopin. So my first question is, I'm curious as to how you made those links and connections in the different countries where you were. You said you did your field work in Liberia, but how did you find these organizations in Sierra Leone, Brazil, and Kosovo? And then my question for Dr. Gopin is, so the example you gave is of women practicing compassion through working with children. And my question is, to what extent is that like nurture, and to what extent is that, what's the other word? If it's not nurture, nature, yes, that's the one. Because I think there is, there's the idea that all that we do and how we behave in the world, there are things that we've been cultured into behaving according to that norm. So we're socialized to behave the way we do. And if that's the case, are women socialized to be more compassionate, and that's why they're able to kind of be peace builders in that context? And if that's the case, what does that imply for men? And so I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
okay, how did I? Are we going to have all several or what?
Yeah, let's, so that we don't run out of time, let's stack up 3 or so questions.
Okay, thanks. I'll try to be brief. As soon as I heard the word infect and then inoculation, I got excited. So I'm going to say the question first and then just give a little background. I'll try to be as brief as possible. Yep. Why don't we intentionally open up a new field of practice and call it educational immunology? Is that brief enough? I could give you a lot of ideas, but the idea of hate as a contagion, apply a cure, and then persistently apply the cure. For 22 years in the Army, I was required to get a flu shot because herd immunity works. But we don't do it for the mind. Educational immunology. If we don't think we're being inoculated in the ways of hate, prejudice, and bitterness right now, we're all mistaken. So we are being inoculated. And sorry, this is even quicker. It's documented. I happen to have it with me. Why should governments shape individual choices? You guys had a UN document. This is a World Development Spotlight report that says, why should governments shape individual choices? So if we want to use the word brainwash, let's use it. We're being brainwashed now.
To tap onto that question, if I could, there's hate, but then there's the idea that, you know, people see the world through a certain set of eyes. That ideology is not necessarily hate, that indifference is not necessarily hate, and that there's probably a whole lot of people in this country who could care less one way or the other about certain people, but they have a certain way of seeing. They see maybe equal opportunity, and they, you know, it doesn't mean they have animus towards another group. So I would like to ask the question about, you know, the idea of ideology, maybe versus or in concert with hate, because I think that I'm both excited about the idea of a kind of a physiology that I think is emerging in this conversation, and I'm also kind of nervous about it. And so I would like to hear about that too.
Can we reserve 2 minutes for Dr. Mitchell?
So I'll just talk about the context, which is easy. I go to a place and walk around and talk to people. And I say, do you know anybody that could talk about this? They say, as a matter of fact, I do. Can I have their contact number? Yes, as a matter of fact, you can. And you just trot over there and meet. So it's very walk. I believe in walking the area. Sometimes I will know somebody ahead of time who knows somebody ahead of time who knows somebody. But when I did my field work in Sierra Leone, I knew one person. I didn't even know them. I'd communicated with them online. So it's that kind of just, which is so much fun.
I'll speak quickly to education and just say briefly the current transition happening in Armenia. We have several of our alums and close colleagues very much involved in that. And some of the protesters who have been the senior leaders of the protesters have decided not to go into government, should this successfully lead to a new government, but rather to stay in civil society and to go into the educational institutions and influence the universities and the educational system as a way for longer term change there, as opposed to you flip-flop who's in the government every so many years. So the education's where they're going. So that's a SCAR influence there.
Well, there's no answer to 1,000 years of questions about nature versus nurture. I've seen evidence of both. There are certain advantages in terms of verbal communication versus nonverbal communication, but I've seen many violations of verbal communication that are perpetrated by overly educated both men and women who don't know how to communicate from somebody in a rural area, and I've seen the opposite. So I think that it's just about the magical effects of compassionate moments that can be evoked that lead to people using their different skills. Some of them are in legislation. Many of the women who went into legislation from caring with the kids together or caring for the girls. So you let people go where they go, but the compassionate moment with the enemy other is what transforms their lives. They sat for the first time with an Alawite. They sit with the first time with a communist or somebody who's secular. Men and women who sit together for the first time as equals, and then it just changes them. And then they go their own ways. So I think that's the key, is how to generate a practice that makes that much more frequent in the battle zones and in the conflict areas. I don't know how to, the medical model is all over my writing, because I find constantly that the medical metaphor helps me understand what I'm seeing on the ground in terms of viral effects of one action versus another, and how it just seems to sweep a room one way or another. One person starts to weep, everyone starts to weep. One person says something angry, they're all fighting in 2 seconds. So the virality and the aspect of infection is a very interesting thing that I think we need to study more in terms of our work. It's just sometimes dangerous to be as crass as saying, well, this is immunology and this is inoculation, because it's condescending, you know, effectively. But we should be aware of the fact that our mental states and mental health very much may have some of the very similar patterns that we're noticing. And then ideology versus hate, I'd like to hear you more deeply on that. You know, it's not just hate ideology, it's selfish ideology. The United States is the most passionately in favor of selfishness as an ideological construct in the Western world. The idea of libertarianism, that nobody should contribute to anything, as perfect freedom, that is freedom, is completely alien to many other communitarian constructs in Europe and other places. So there's many ideological constructs, but I think Lakoff is innovating because he says that's a kind of neural linguistic net, and that care and compassion sometimes break those nets and have you see the other versus seeing the ideological debate as the only thing that's important. And that's what I'm trying. I'm trying to humanize the enemy other, not to get agreement, but to get what compassion does as opposed to separation of neural nets and ideology, which is all over Facebook, etc. It's like, what is it that transforms relationship is what I'm after. Chris Mitchell.
This is ridiculous. Why, drum roll, please. Thank you. Okay, I just want to say a word in sort of favor of you know, the flawed practices of the past, as somebody described it, which Dennis and I were involved in for 30 odd years. On this whole business of compassion, I couldn't agree more. And I think one of the things that we found was that, and I think it's almost universal, you can get people to feel compassionate for the other side through children, talking about their children. That seems to me to be something that almost any culture is affected by. Very much. I mean, you mentioned Carter and you know, Camp David as one example. I remember Elise Boulding, for example, who always had this sort of practical idea of getting people to, you know, at least think about the other side as human. And she would say, why don't we think about what society or your society is going to be like in 30 years' time? 30 years' time. That's grandchildren, okay? And then she would say, well, how do you actually get there? Can you think about working back what would be necessary, what you would need to do in order to get? And she would walk them back through stages to where they are at the moment, and they would realize there is a way out. You know, there are choices to be made. It was a very impressive thing to watch her work. And the only other thing is, yeah, I think we knew about surprise as well. I mean, the whole business about thinking outside the box is about surprise. And that's a technique that we've been using quite a long time. So, you know, it wasn't all bad 30 years ago. It was just pretty bad. And thanks to you guys, it's getting a lot better.
I would love to, we're done? I have 30 seconds. I would love to basically collect as a repository all the practices that have been going on for a long time, of which there is a sense of caring that is promoted for the other, in which case I would call that for a sympathetic understanding and a desire to relieve suffering and so on. Our field fundamentally, I mean, we talk a lot about engagement and understanding and so on. Our field is a field of transformation. We are basically committed as in medicine, I think that's an appropriate analogy, to transformation. And the challenge, of course, is the techniques that bring them along, you know, not too heavy-handed, not too weak, and so on. I would, again, as Susan and I mentioned, I think systemic compassion is a kind of perspective to take on certain forms of practice, maybe not all.
So thank you to the panel. Thank you.
Did I go over? I went over.
Thank you. As we close out the first annual Dennis Sandole Research Conference, and thinking about Dennis particularly as in some ways the first full-time dedicated faculty person in 1981. And this is a personal reflection for me on all the papers and all of the commentary, all of the discussion that I've heard today. You know, one of the driving ethoses of the folks who began then the Center for Conflict Resolution and ICAR and so forth was this commitment to the recognition that conflict is complex, that you have to approach it from a variety of different methodologies, epistemologies, which Angelina referred to, that no one discipline in the social sciences, or indeed in the humanities or in philosophy, we're finally bringing those humanities in, can really encompass it. And when I reflect upon the papers today and the discussion today, and I don't say this is exhaustive, I've left some out, but I've seen Thomas talk about essentially a methodology of international political economy. Thomas also convinced me that Harvard has a lot to answer for, but that's different. Solon and Weberian ideal types, rich and comparative history, but informed by deep personal biography, which, you know, is C. Wright Mills's notion of you link up biography to history. I mean, you capitulate Mills here. Participatory action research, community-based research about conflict-saturated symbols, narrative and discourse analysis, Bourdieu, neuroscience, agent-based modeling. And I'm sorry, Julie, but throughout your talk, I just kept thinking of Julie Shedd and the Algorithmics as a rock band I would stay up late for, actually.
Oh, yeah.
But so you know, in some ways, this entire day reflected the original mission of ESCAR, which is a kind of testament to the fact that if you're going to try to understand something as complex and as destructive and as deeply rooted as social conflict, you have to bring together all of the epistemologies and all of the methodologies that you heard about today, and in a way you can't privilege any of them. So this was a kind of echt ESCAR conference. Dennis would be proud. You know, I have to say there is a counter discourse, because if I was thinking of Julie's rock group as this was going on, I was also thinking of a more orthodox, disciplinary-based scholar sitting here, whether from sociology or political science or whatever, and saying, these people are all over the place. You know, there is no damn focus to this place. You know, what are they doing? You know, Solon Simmons once referred to disciplines as kind of churches in the Weberian sense. I guess that makes us sects or cults, I'm not sure. But, you know, and when you're in a church, you have a very comfortable identity. You have your doctrine, your dogma, your doxology, your orthodoxy and your orthopraxis, and that really is a sense of identity for political scientists who study conflicts. When you step outside the church, I think you're in a different world, and you're open to more interfaith, ecumenical kinds of conversations, but you sometimes pay a price for that. One of the prices you pay is that people consider you, at best, heterodox or schismatic. And that's how we began ICAR SCAR. That's how Dennis began ICAR SCAR. And I'm happy to stand with him and with you kind of outside the church of disciplinary orthodoxy. The other thing, of course, that all of these papers had in common, which was also part of the original ethos, is that they, all of them in their own way, some more viscerally than others, all of them circled back to work in the world. All of them circled back to practice. And that was the other thing that Dennis and Rich and Chris and others who are no longer with us strived for. And I think we touched some of that